Hey everyone, thanks for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Nelson from JCU. I'm going to do, Paul is originally from Adelaide in South Australia, and his research revolves mostly around the cycling of water, carbon, and nutrients in tropical agricultural systems. He got his bachelor's degree many years ago at the University of Adelaide, and then he worked in industry in Australia and Europe for several years, then came back to the University of Adelaide to do his PhD. He finalized in 1997, which is 25 years ago now. And he has an incredible experience both in the private and public sectors, including CSIRO. And I noticed a pattern here in which you have been moving south to north until you reached the best place in Australia to live, which is of course Cairns, as you all know. And he's been doing a great job, as you must know, working with land managers, farming industry, and scientifically. So without further ado, Paul.
Thanks, Danny. Okay, thanks everyone for coming along. Good to see live people. So a few months ago, I was asked to write a book chapter with this title. And so when Yoko asked me to do a seminar, I thought, okay, I'll do the seminar on this topic for two reasons. One, to give myself a bit of a kick in the backside to get this thing together. And two, to enlist your help to write it. So I'm looking forward to comments and questions because at the moment it's still pretty rough. So that's what I'm expecting from you. And yeah, if we don't have time today, hopefully we'll have time today, but if we don't, then my email address is there and I'd like to continue the conversation. So I'd like to particularly acknowledge, I suppose, the many farmers I've spoken to over the years because a lot of the ideas have come from them, but also from colleagues and students. And so a lot of people have been involved in the ideas that I'll be talking about. So we're going to be dependent on agriculture for the foreseeable future. And to be sustainable, it's important that the land is maintained in a good condition or improved. So soil quality, it's the basis of that sustainability. So the people and crops and animals come and go, but the soil's always there. So that has to be looked after. And, you know, these are some of the questions that farmers and their advisors sort of ask about soil. So first, let's look at the context. So in my lifetime, which as Danny said is quite long, but the global demand for food and other agricultural products has doubled. And that's essentially because the population's doubled. That's basically what's happened. So there's twice as many people who need to eat and be clothed and house themselves. And that's going to continue, world population is going to continue to increase till about 2100 when it's probably going to level. That's what the predictions say. Could do anything, of course, but that's, so it's going to keep growing till about 2100 when we'll reach about 10 billion roughly. So the area of land devoted to agriculture is fairly stable or contracting slightly in many countries, including Australia. So that's the green countries on the map there. But for every hectare we return to forest in Australia, and a lot of us are putting a lot of effort into that, another hectare has to be cleared somewhere else to provide that production or more. And you can see that most of the expansion of agriculture, that's the red colours, is happening in the tropics. And that's not going to stop for a while because there's still land available, which has good productive potential in the tropics, and there's still demand. So that clearing or that expansion of agriculture is going to increase. We can say that pretty definitely. So a few definitions. So first, tropical agriculture. Well, it's really diverse and varied, of course, but a few points here that sort of define a little bit. So we go from subsistence agriculture, which there's quite a lot in the tropics, more than in other parts of the world, to sort of industrial corporate agriculture, and there's everything in between, lots of different sort of combinations of that. So subsistence, a few words there to sort of describe it. It's often a dynamic integration of all sorts of things: gardens, orchard, cultivated fields, fallows, food in the bush, semi-cultivated food, drought food, sago swamps, all sorts of things sort of come into that category of subsistence. And the complexity tends to be greatest where the environment is the most benign, where you've got the best soils, the best rainfall tends to be where you get the most complexity. On the other end, we've got industrial, which agriculture, which is simpler systems, sort of almost by definition, and rice and maize are the big areas, the big, the big production. But you've also got those other crops that are the most common. One thing that's interesting with tropical agriculture compared to other agriculture is that there's quite a lot of vegetative propagation. So we've got a lot of tubers and bananas, which are clonal propagation, which is sort of sets it apart a bit from agriculture in most of the rest of the world. And probably one of the most defining things is that it's changing rapidly. Like, in the sort of last 10 years of going backwards and forwards to PMG and backwards and forwards to the tablelands, things have changed rapidly in all those areas. That's probably everywhere in the world, but certainly in the tropics. So a little bit about that diversity. So if we go to, so in subsistence systems, crop diversity is the norm. And even where people grow cash crops, which is increasingly the case, it's often really diverse as well. So this is just some results from some survey that we did in the project recently in East New Britain, in Papua New Guinea. We went to cocoa growers, so people who identified themselves as cocoa growers, and surveyed the crops, the varieties of crops that were in their cocoa blocks, okay? And so these ones along the bottom were not yet planted to cocoa, but they were going to be planted. All the others were planted different ages. And we first asked the people, do you grow food crops in your cocoa block or not? And some said yes, or they said yes or no. But whether they said yes or no, there were always food crops in their cocoa blocks, which was interesting. So even if they said no, you've got here 6 or 7 varieties of food crop being grown in there, and up to 70 or 65 varieties of food crops. So that's pretty normal. That's the norm, that sort of diversity. Defining tropical soils. So again, they're really diverse. So there are a lot of generalizations that are often wrong, but I'll generalize anyway. So you tend to get intense rainfall, which means you've got a lot of erosive and leaching pressure. It might only be for a short time of the year, but generally in the tropics, you've got a period of intense rainfall. And the soils, typically, they're highly weathered, so therefore fairly infertile, which means they're mostly quartz, kaolinite, clay, and oxides. They've got low cation exchange capacity, and most of the nutrient holding capacity in the soils is related to their organic matter content and the pH rather than the minerals, which is the case in temperate soils. But aside from those generalizations, there's huge varieties. You've got really sandy soils, really clay soils, acid sulfate soils, peats, soils on coral, steep soils, soils with ferrocrete with rocky layers through them, waterlogged soils, recent volcanic ash. So everything happens in the tropics. So there's no, there's no one group of soils. Third definition is sustainability, sustainable soil management. So if we go back to sort of one of the first formal definitions of sustainability from the Brundtland report there, saying sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. You could argue about the definition of sustainable development, but if we cross that out and put sustainable soil management, I think we could all agree that if you're meeting the needs of today's people and the needs of people in the future, that's sustainable. So, so what are some of the principles of sustainable soil management? So here's a bit of a distillation where really it's about maximising plant productivity per unit area. It's about maximising biological activity and diversity. It's about using soils appropriately and tolerating their limitations. So some soils are capable of, more intense use than others. Eliminating consumption of non-renewable resources and preventing degradation and encouraging improvement. So that's all very well as sort of general motherhood statements, but how do we prevent degradation and encourage improvement? So really in one sentence, the main enemies of soil quality in the tropics are, starting with the most destructive one, loss of topsoil by erosion, decline in organic matter content, acidification, compaction, contamination, and build-up of disease. So erosion happens when the soil isn't covered. So if you can see the soil, you've got a problem. People think because I'm a soil scientist, I like looking at soil. I don't. I don't like seeing soil. If you see soil, there's something wrong. You don't want to see it. Decline in organic matter happens when the loss by decomposition is greater than the input in plant residues. Acidification happens when the outputs from the soil aren't balanced by the inputs, and compaction happens mostly through the poor use of machinery. And contamination happens when non-decomposable materials are applied and build up. And disease normally happens if you have a monoculture for too long, or it builds up when you have monoculture. That doesn't mention the loss of soils to urbanisation, which is complete, not degradation, but elimination of good soils that's happening everywhere, including the tropics, or mostly in the tropics, because we tend to live where the soils are good, and then we build and build and build on them and eliminate them completely. But that's another topic. So anything you hear about soil biological health or production of good quality food and so on are related to these processes. And all of them are related to the way people manage the land. So, okay, so sorry, I've gone through the top ones, but I didn't go through the bottom ones. So the top ones are about the sort of on-site processes that affect agricultural production. But then we've also got these other functions of soil that are important to maintain the sustainability. And functions like the interaction with the atmosphere, so production of greenhouse gases or consumption of greenhouse gases, and things like transfer of sediment and nutrients into aquatic ecosystems. So they're also degrading functions of, or those functions can be degraded. So all this knowledge, there's a lot of science around this, a lot of research. And when I came to writing the chapter, or thinking about the chapter, I sort of started looking at the literature, and Kajal helped me here, and did a quick search on how many publications there are on those topics and tropical and agriculture. And in the last 10 years, there's 328,000 papers. So no wonder, I had this vague uneasiness that I wasn't keeping up with the literature, and now I know why. So there's a lot of information, a lot of useful information. So you could ask so why does degradation persist in some places when we know so much about it, obviously? And some farmers are improving their soil. It's not degrading everywhere. So what I decided to do for this chapter is to take a broad view and try to distill it. So it's pretty broad, so I'm going to skip over a lot of really important detail, unfortunately, but we'll see how it goes. So I've adopted the DPSIR framework, which I'll explain what that means in a second, but basically it's a causal framework that people use to describe the interactions between humans and the environment. And DPSIR, of that acronym, S stands for the state. And in this case, we're looking at the state of soil. We could call that quality or condition or health, different words are used. And why are we interested in the state of soil? Well, it has impacts on us. So it has impacts on productivity, environment, so on. And yeah, so basically there's sort of two main sets of functions soil has. One is in agriculture, is to produce food and so on, and the other is these ecosystem services, which are things that the farmer won't necessarily benefit from, but the rest of us do. So that's sort of the definition of ecosystem services. Then the state of the soil is influenced by pressures, that's the P in the acronym, which are the things that we do to the soil. And why do farmers do those things? Well, there are certain drivers on farmers. And then the sort of cycle is closed by, well, how do we respond to those impacts? So that's the DPSIR framework that I'll be using. So I'm going to be going through it, starting at the, where was I going to start? I'm going to start at the impacts, and then I'll work anti-clockwise back to the responses. So the impacts, so I've sort of covered this already pretty much, pretty small writing there, sorry about that. But basically, we can think of the Earth as four spheres. We've got the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the lithosphere. And the definition of soil is the interaction of all those four spheres. Okay, that's the first thing I'll say to students in my classes, is that's the definition of soil, where those four spheres actually interact to the greatest degree on Earth. And the biosphere, well, the main part of that we see is plants, and the main function we think about is the production of plants. But and there's all sorts of things soil do for plants. They provide support and oxygen, water, and nutrients, beneficial organisms, and so on. But soils, the state of soil also influences ecosystems around, especially downstream. So aquatic ecosystems are influenced by processes that happen in the soil. The soil impacts on the hydrosphere as well, because it retains water and releases water and solutes and so on. And it influences the flow of water and is a big part of the flow of water. Influences the atmosphere because there's gases being produced in the soil and being consumed by the soil. So most of the CO2 being generated on Earth, apart from what we burn, is coming from the soil because it's being generated by all the microbes in the soil. And it has effects on the lithosphere, so the cycling of elements, the weathering of minerals and so on. So they're the impacts. So now I'm going to focus most of the talk on the state of the soil and the pressures on it. So the pressures are sort of the non-human things. There's a whole lot of things that I won't talk about, and I'll focus on the human pressures on the soil. So a bit more lecturing. So a summary of a good soil state. Soils 101. Yeah, I'm sure you're all good people, so you've all studied soil, so a bit of a reminder. So basically, we often talk about the biological properties and chemical properties of physical, not because they're actually separate, but just easier to separate and talk about them. So a good soil state, biologically, you've got abundant, diverse, active populations of all 6 kingdoms on Earth. They all exist in the soil. You've got a low population and low virulence of pathogens, and you've got high population of organisms that are directly beneficial to plants. The chemical state, you've got a high energy supply for the organisms, and that's the organic matter content. You've got a high nutrient holding capacity and high nutrient content, that's sort of balanced. You've got optimum pH, and you've got low concentrations of toxins. And physically, you've got a soil that's very porous, that allows water and air to get through it, and it's friable, it breaks up easily, roots can push through it easily, and it's stable against structural collapse and erosion. So when you wet it, it stays there, it doesn't collapse. So that's a sort of quick definition of the state of a good state of soil. And that's all those things are influenced by management and the inherent properties of the soil. And, you know, soils naturally range from really fertile with all those things great to really infertile with all those things really bad. Naturally, you get that whole suite of properties. So the first thing is that you can't maintain soil in a good state if you're losing topsoil. So most of the organisms, most of the fertility is in the top few centimetres. So erosion is the worst thing that can happen to soil by far. And here, this is a bit of a summary where erosion is often sort of modelled or described by what's called the universal soil loss equation, and it has these 5 factors. And then what I've got here is the pressures, and they're either the human, the management pressures, and then the environmental factors, which are unmanaged. You've got a whole lot of sort of natural things. So what are the things that people actually do that influence the erodibility and the erosion? So people plant things, they kill other plants, they add things like organic amendments, they do something with the residues of the plant, so you harvest some and export it, but then the rest of it you do something with it. You walk over it or drive over it and cultivate it, and you might actually change the actual topography of the soil as well. So these are things that people actually do, and they influence the erosion by influencing these factors, and that influences soil loss. You can also get soil gain by deposition from upslope, and that's really important in some parts of the world as well. So the thing about soil erosion is that's pretty visible, so you can pretty well tell if you've got a lot of erosion or not. You see it in the water and the bare areas. So in a way, it's sort of relatively easy to handle in that it's obvious what's going on. The next once you've said, all right, we don't want to lose soil, then you have to look at the properties in the soil. And one of the most important properties, and it's also one of the ones that's managed or influenced by people the most, is this organic matter content. And so it's a key aspect of all the biology and chemistry and physics of the soil. So we've got here again, the green arrows are human pressures, and the red arrows are sort of natural ones. The brown arrows are fluxes of organic matter. So you've got organic matter that goes into the soil. So plants put it in when their roots die, or the roots are exuding organic matter, and then the litter puts it in as well, and it's sort of roughly 50-50 for most plants. So about half of it is going into the soil. People might add organic matter from somewhere else, and then that surface organic matter, it only gets into the soil if animals actually bury it. Okay, so the roots, they're putting organic matter into the soil, but all the rest of it actually has to get buried, so you need animals to do that for you, or cultivate it as well. And then it cycles around, so you've got sort of consumption, excretion, grazing, predation, growth, death, all of that going on in the soil. And most of the loss is then due to microbial decomposition. So the more microorganisms you have, the more will be mineralized to carbon dioxide. And really it's the balance between these inputs and the outputs that determines how much you have. So the amount is important, but the cycling is also really important, and I'll get back to that. So the more that's going in and the more that's coming out, it's better because you've got more biological, that means you've got more biological activity. Then you might also have charcoal, which is a bit different, which is from burn vegetation, and that tends to not cycle around, so it tends to sort of accumulate in the soil. So a bit about biological activity in soil, organic matter. So we've done a fair bit of work in plantations, and they're a nice way to explore this sort of spatial variability that you typically get in tropical systems. And they're nice because they're repeatable patterns, so you can sort of see what's happening in different parts of a variable system. And so here we've got, this is the repeating unit in an oil palm plantation that's planted in triangular spacing, where you've got a trunk, you've got a weeded area around the trunk that's kept bare. You've got a place where they put the fronds, the prune fronds, place where you get access, either on foot or by vehicle. And here a place where they put, in this case, they put residues from the mill, so they're recycling organic matter back from the mill. And this unit is repeated, so we did intensive measurements in this unit, and then if you replicate that, you can extrapolate through the whole plantation. So this is one of the main inputs, is root biomass, and you can see that it's really concentrated. So most of it's going in here and not so much around here. And this is an index of the biological activity, so the respiration. And you can see that it's also really variable. So there's sort of a five-fold difference from one point to another, unlike a wheat crop. So this is really important to understand this variability. And you can see that most of the biological activity is where the organic matter is going in. So it's either where the roots are putting it in, or where the residues are being placed, or the byproducts from the mill are being placed. And there's not much going on here. So it's really spatially variable, and I'll get back to that later, because it poses a challenge for understanding how soil is changing. You need to account for that spatial variability. Just some other results from some of our students here. The biological activity, it affects all sorts of things, and one of them is the suppression of diseases. So here, this is Alison Bowen's honours work, where she took 6 soils which covered the range of soil types in the banana industry in Australia, and so quite a big variety of different soils there. And this is essentially an index of biological activity. It's the activity of a really common enzyme that most microorganisms have. And this is the disease severity, where you inoculate the pots with fusarium, which is a disease. So they're all inoculated. And where you have the highest biological activity, you've got the lowest disease severity. So that biological activity is suppressing the activity of the pathogen, or the effect of the pathogen. And then Ryan Orr, he spoke recently, so he's showed that you can influence that biological activity by managing the nutrients, and that also affects the disease severity. So that's just a quick sort of look into some of the effects of organic matter and biological activity. The other thing, apart from organic matter, is the pH of the soil. That's really important. And more than the pH, it's actually the acid neutralizing capacity of the soil, which pH is sort of an index of what's happening, but really the property of the soil that's most important is this. And it's pretty complicated, but basically the orange arrows are processes that are causing acidification, and the purple arrows are processes that are causing alkalization. And the inputs, various things that people put in, can make it go either way. And then there are outputs, there are gases and solutes that are leaching out that can make it go either way. And the balance of all of those things will essentially influence the acid neutralising capacity of the soil and the pH. And so it's sort of similar but different things. So to what I had before for organic matter, so the species is important. If you're pruning, the fallow, and what you're applying, you know, in terms of fertiliser and lime or ash, organic matter amendments or water, they all influence how quickly the soil is acidified. And again, just some results to look at that process. So this is so these are soil analyses from an oil palm plantation in 1989 and 2002. It's a 13-year period there in the topsoil. And it was a fertiliser experiment, a long-term fertiliser experiment where these bars had no fertiliser and these ones with various types of fertiliser. So we started off with the orange dots of the pH on this side. So we started off with a pH around a bit above 6. And now this is unusually high for a tropical soil. This is a really good soil. It's a recent volcanic ash soil. And you can see that over that time period, even with no fertiliser, the pH dropped from above 6 to below 5.8. So that's a natural thing that's happening. pH is dropping that quickly in a soil that is recent volcanic ash. And if you add fertiliser, the pH has dropped even further because it's influencing those cycling processes I mentioned. So the pH is dropping, but probably more importantly is the cations that the soil is holding. So the yellow bars are the acidity, which is basically toxicity to plants, and these other coloured bars are basically essential nutrients. And you can see that the amount of essential nutrients that the soil holds has declined, and it varies depending on the type of fertiliser and so on. So that's important. Now, acidification also depends on the water balance, depends on things going in and out. So getting back to the spatial variability, if you look at that repeating unit, and if you go from the trunk out to the furthest point from the trunk, that's what we're looking at here, so the distance from the trunk. And this is the amount of water that hits the ground. This is in a 1 month measuring period. And the amount of rain was 200 millimetres in that time, but the amount of water that hit the ground went from less than 100 to up to around 300 millimetres because it's redistributed by the canopy. And again, in agroforestry or any sort of variable system like this, the water that's hitting the ground can be almost an order of magnitude different depending on where you are. So that's going to influence the leaching of materials. Okay, so where you put your fertiliser, for example, it'll be really acidifying if you put it here, and it'll cause hardly any acidification if you put it here. So that's important to know. And okay, this is another part of the water balance where this is actually this is the water input, this is the water uptake. So the plants are taking up most of that water, and this line is close to the trunk here, and this line is essentially all the rest of the area. So close to the trunk, you've got not much water going in and a lot of water coming out. It's quite a dry environment there, which influences all these processes. So, okay, now I want to shift gear for a moment, and I want to, so there's lots of evidence for degradation of state of soil. There's many studies that show that soil's degrading in many places, but we also know of systems where the soil management seems to be sustainable. And I want to just talk about 3 examples. So this first, the traditional subak system of rice cultivation in Bali and Java. So over a long period of time, the people there have organised themselves in the farming systems so that it's productive and sustainable. And it's been awarded World Heritage Cultural status for that. So the soil quality, it's been maintained essentially by preventing erosion and by balancing the inputs and outputs. And another thing that's important, it is a fertile soil to start with, so they have an advantage there. It's fertile, recent volcanic ash, and they've got a good supply of water that's, you know, they can distribute. They distribute it between each other equitably and sustainably. There's very little erosion because of these stable permanent terraces, and there's not a lot of export of product. Okay, it's essentially a subsistence system. So it's cycling, it's not a lot leaving the place. There is nitrogen required, and that's put into the system by the symbiotic relationship with these floating ferns and bacteria. So there's nitrogen fixation going on there. And so and the other thing that's important here is the flooding. So these soils naturally acidify, but the flooding under those conditions, it brings the soil pH back up to neutral because of the processes that happen in a saturated environment. So that's part of the sustainability. A different example, quite different. So this is shifting cultivation. So throughout the humid tropics, shifting agricultural systems are really common. So they're sometimes known as swidden or slash and burn. And they've operated for hundreds or thousands of years, which is by definition sustainable, basically. They keep producing on that same land. So the basic system is that you clear a bit of bush and you plant crops and you grow crops for a few years. And during that time, the soil fertility runs down quite quickly. And that's mostly because the soil organic matter is declining and the soil's acidifying. You might get erosion as well, but not necessarily because they tend to be quite small patches of land. So then when the crops are no longer productive, you abandon the garden, you allow the bush to take over. And after a fallow of 10 years or so or more, the fertility is restored and you clear it again. And off you go again. And so here in this part of PNG, the first crop they grow is taro. And taro will grow for 1, 2, maybe 3 crops until the soil fertility is no longer enough to support it. And then they'll go into sweet potato and other crops for the couple of years. And taro is really important to the Nakanai people culturally, and nutritionally as well. It's an integral part of culture there, so it's really important to them. So after a few years, they'll grow a few crops and then they'll abandon it after about 5 years. So again, we can think about, well, why is that sustainable? Well, one, again, there's no real net export of materials because it's a subsistence system. So things are cycling around, and it's sort of, spatially moving around, but essentially there's no real export. And they had fertile soil to start with, which helped as well. And unlike many places where subsistence agriculture is practiced, where they don't have a fertile soil to start with, it's a lot harder to maintain. And also here they've had recent volcanic ash deposits, or volcanic ash is still being deposited, like the Java example, which helps as well because that's adding nutrition to the soil. The third example I'll give you is quite different because it's not a traditional system. It's industrial, it's commercial, simplified, and it's one of the oldest industrial agricultural systems in the tropics, oil palm on the North Sumatra plains. So the Dutch imported oil palm to North Sumatra in the mid-1800s, and in the beginning of the 20th century, a commercial system started, and they've been growing oil palm continually since the beginning of the 1900s. And recent soil analyses that we've done there, and the fact that production has been going up, says that it's sustainable. So it's it's been going for over 100 years, and it's still going strong. So basically, that's because a couple of things. One, it's a perennial crop, and so it's never cultivated. And remember that cultivation and erosion results as one of the worst enemies. So they don't cultivate it. It's got full canopy cover the whole time, so there's a lot of organic matter going into the system. It's on flat land, so there's virtually no erosion. And the outputs are being balanced by the inputs. So one of the advantages of this particular product is that when you export oil, oil is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that's it. And where do they come from? They come from the air and the water. So you can have a system that isn't exporting a lot of material, so you're not having that degradation. They do export a bit of nitrogen in the meal and seed meal, and they do add nitrogen in. And so there's legumes that are grown between when they replant, they grow legumes which grow for a few years until they get shaded out. So you'll hear lots of bad stories about oil palm. You've only got to Google oil palm and all you hear is bad news. But the crop itself, there's nothing wrong with the crop itself, okay? It can be grown badly like any crop, and if you steal the land off the people, that's bad, and if you clear rainforest, that's bad. So all those things are bad, but the actual crop itself isn't bad. And similarly to the Subuck system, rice can be grown badly as well, but they can be grown sustainably. So land quality is maintained in these systems because a couple of conditions which I haven't yet mentioned, and one is that the people there have long-term control over their land, and that's important because if people are thinking about their children, they'll look after the land. The other thing that's important is that they've got enough land to be viable, and where people don't have enough land to be viable, they will overexploit the land, basically. So you've got to be able to make a living or either subsistence or whatever out of the land for sustainable systems to evolve. But given those conditions, people have worked out ways of making it sustainable. Now this photo is from the same region as the last one where I showed shifting cultivation, from the Nakanai region in PNG in New Britain. And it's almost identical in terms of climate, geology, soils, culture. But the main difference is that here in this village of Rapuri, the population has increased, so the amount of land per person has decreased, and the fallows have consequently shortened to the extent where there's hardly any fallow in this village now. It's permanent agriculture, pretty much. And when they talk about fallow, they're talking about grass growing for 6 months, as opposed to down the road, they're talking about bush growing for 10 to 20 years. So their soil fertility has declined so much that they can't grow taro anymore. Now, taro is still culturally really important, but they actually buy their taro from somewhere else, from the other village. So they still eat a lot of taro, but it's all bought. And what they're growing here is cassava, which is this long leaf thing you can see here at Bertha's feet. And it's now their main staple. So within the lives of these people, they used to call cassava pig food, because they just fed it to pigs, whereas now it's their main food. And now cassava is very tolerant of poor conditions, but if the soil continues to degrade, even cassava will struggle. But cassava is pretty good on poor soils. So this change from shifting to permanent agriculture, it's recently happened, or it's happening everywhere as we speak. It's a really rapid change that's happening throughout the tropics. And it illustrates one of the main problems with decline in soil fertility, that it happens gradually and invisibly, so you don't necessarily realise until it's too late. So there's no obvious erosion happening here, but the soil is much less fertile than it was 10, 20 years ago. So you need those conditions, but you also need knowledge and tools to help predict what's going to happen under changing conditions. And that's pretty much the rule now. We've got changing conditions pretty much everywhere. So we need to be able to predict what's going to happen when these conditions change, or how we respond to them. Most farmers you talk to now are doing things very differently to what their parents did. And that's everywhere. So just to summarise some of those management pressures I talked about. So while we often focus on the state of the soil, I think it's important to focus on what we're actually doing to the soil, because that's what needs to be changed if the soil's declining in fertility. So plants, you've got to maximise the biomass production basically, and root proliferation. Weeds, you want to maximise the diversity and only remove the ones that are detrimental or going to become detrimental. Residues, you want to maximise retention and only export product, preferably only carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. And you want to maintain the cover. Additions, you want to add things to, as far as possible, remove any constraints to biomass production. It's all about producing biomass, and you want to remove those constraints. You can produce as much biomass as you can. And then replace losses and recycle. Often people talk about adding organic matter, which is great, but you have to be aware that then you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, because that organic matter has been produced somewhere and you're taking it away from that soil and putting it on this one. So you really want to produce biomass in situ. And you need to minimise cultivation and disturbance, and sensibly manage the water, again, to maximise biomass and stop erosion. So we pretty much know those things, but farmers, not all farmers necessarily do them on their particular farm. And why is that? So now let's get on to the drivers. So So really, as scientists and as farmers, there's not much we can do about that first one, the demand for produce. But there's quite a lot that can be done sort of about the second one. So the sort of the influences of society on people and the actual farmers' knowledge and skills and so on. So now on to responses. So what I've got here is a suite of responses, and I'll just sort of go through them one by one. So regulation, it doesn't really make sense except for extremes, and it has been useful there. So if people are really buggering up their land, you can make laws. But it's and it's used in things like reef regulations here, where the amount of fertiliser you put on is actually regulated. So we do use it, but it's a pretty blunt instrument. Certification is that sort of has lots of appealing aspects to it, and I've been a bit involved in some of those certification schemes. And that's where basically, you get a tick or a label on your product if you do things well. And there's lots of different types of certification schemes. And they're nice because, the consumer that way is involved. They can choose what they want to buy, and therefore that has an influence on the farmer. The farmer gets the benefit of doing things in a good way. So they have that nice advantage, and they're voluntary. So, people are doing what they want to do, which is good. But there's a limited demand for credited products, basically. Not everyone cares too much about it. So there's always a demand for products that aren't certified, a bigger demand so far. And also some of the certification schemes can easily become a bit simplistic and become slogans where people expect more than actually occurs. So you have to really look into them, what effect they're actually having. Payment for ecosystem services. So that's where, the government or some sort of society manipulates the market. And there's a lot of hype around that. And there are some advantages. So for example, at the moment in Australia, there's a lot of talk around payment for soil carbon. There's a lot more talk than actual action. There's a lot of advice and companies sort of telling you they can measure your carbon and so on, but there's not that many farmers that are actually making money out of increasing their carbon yet for a number of reasons. And it's only sort of a limit to where you can go with that. And one of the reasons that's a bit, it's not a bad thing, but one of the reasons that's a blunt instrument is that the amount of carbon in the soil, or organic matter, I sort of use those interchangeably, is important, but the cycling is also important, and that's not accounted for in the amount of soil. So if you've got a lot of organic matter going in and a lot of turnover, but yet not increasing the amount, that's great for the biology and it's great for the ecology, but you're not actually going to get a carbon credit for that. You need to make the amount go greater. So, it doesn't have all the benefits that people would like it to. There's talk about giving incentives for having healthy soils, and that's really interesting. But I can't quite see how it's going to work because healthy soils are so complex. How are you actually going to measure and pay and, make sure that that's... So, while I think it's a great idea and it's worth talking about, I'm not wildly enthusiastic about that having a big effect. There are things like reef credits, which are just coming in, and they're a form of ecosystem service payment, which are related to soil management. So it's happening. And in some parts of the world where you've got water catchments with drinking water for cities, it's quite a big thing where farmers will be paid to, reduce erosion, basically. But that's quite limited in area. It doesn't apply to most places. So these sort of blunt ones, they have appeal because they sort of seem direct, but they're not going to be the be-all and end-all. Policy in the agricultural field, sort of, we scientists have tended to ignore that a bit and focus on practice rather than policy. And myself, likewise, I wasn't never really interested in policy till quite recently when I found out that the Queensland government doesn't actually have a policy for sustainable soil and water management or use, which sort of shocked me and shocked the people in the Department of Environment and Science that I was talking to today. For sure, no, that's true. Queensland government doesn't actually have a policy. Last year, the Australian government got a national soil strategy. So the Australian government has a policy on soil health now. And that's had some effect. So the Australian government is now putting money towards that, which is good. But constitutionally, it's the states that are responsible for the land. So it's a bit of an odd situation. The federal government doesn't actually have constitutional responsibility for state of the soil. Yeah, I don't know about the other states other than Queensland. I've been meaning to look into that, but I don't yet know. What else? Where are we? So knowledge sharing, okay, that's unarguably good. Education and knowledge sharing are always good, especially these days when we're in an era of instant sharing of rubbish. So it's more and more important that we share, substantial knowledge, robust, good knowledge. The National Soil Strategy has actually led to an improvement in that. So here, the Drought Hub based here has now got money to employ a regional soil extension officer, and the Soil Science Society are employing a national one, and so on. So that there's a bit of good action there. Basically, to fill the gap that the states used to do that stuff, but they don't really anymore. There used to be soil conservation officers. There aren't anymore. So we're sort of getting something that we'd lost before, basically. Access, that's a sort of broad one, but so for example, in huge parts of Africa, one of the main problems with sustainable soil management is that people don't have access to phosphorus fertiliser, basically. If they got a tiny bit of phosphorus fertiliser, they would be able to increase the production and things would be much more sustainable. And that's well known, it's well documented, but it remains a problem for many people. Here, that's obviously not an issue. And that's just one example of access. Research, okay, obviously we all think research is good, but I sort of want to make a point here that most of agricultural research is driven around production rather than maintaining the resource, and it's always going to be that way. But it's important, all the things we do to increase production all affect the soil. So we need to always think about the consequences for the soil of, increasing plant yield or whatever. So it's important to always keep that in mind. And then the last one I think is probably the most important, because innovation, there have been fantastic innovations over recent years. Like now you can buy machines that will sow seeds into the ground without disturbing the ground, okay? And that's a massive influence on improving sustainability of soil management, just by not disturbing the soil, not allowing it to erode. So there's big changes. Innovation is really important, has been in the past, will be in the future. Things like, the best way to introduce biological control agents, so you don't have to use pesticides. There's all sorts of ways that people are developing to do that. So, and that's really the critical thing. Gee, I've taken a lot longer than I thought I would. I'm going to leave time to. I was going to talk a bit about predictive and decision support tools, but I'm not going to. Oh, it's tempting, isn't it? Because most farmers, I'm going to read the top line, most farmers never analyse their soil. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, especially for a soil scientist. So we have to think of ways of helping them improve their soil without them analysing, okay? And we're doing research in that, which I'm not going to talk about because of time, rather have some discussion. So some concluding thoughts. So soil function management in tropical agriculture, vital for human wellbeing, ecosystem health globally. Farmers, given security of tenure, sufficient land to be viable, and knowledge, whether that's traditional or scientific or both, they have developed and they will develop sustainable soil management systems, so it's not all bad. But there may be little incentive for them to manage soil functions that are not related to productivity, so you have to keep that in mind. Things like water quality won't be top of mind for a farmer who's trying to survive. So we need to improve our way of encouraging that. And the drivers are changing rapidly, so that poses a few challenges. One, because the response of the soil state is often quite slow and difficult to detect and not necessarily front of mind for the farmer. So that's a challenge. And so it also means that knowledge sharing and generation, developing new tools and approaches is more crucial than ever. So there we go. Big rush over a big topic. And I welcome any comments or questions.